mansions in most cases, and hear a little bit about the historic people that have lived in them or built them over the years. Most of them are lost. There are some that we're going to talk about that are still here, and mainly in comparisons. So probably only a few of you can really remember these actually standing anywhere. Some went down in the 20s, but many went down in the 70s. Besides all the information I'm going to throw at you tonight, and there won't be a test, so you can doze off or think about a daydream a little bit if you need to. But this program is meant to raise your awareness about what we have lost and what we could lose. The more awareness we have, the more advocacy we can supply. And we can, as Snyder Pippin is talking about, not putting something where it would be inappropriate. Also, not knocking down something that doesn't have to go. Tonight's program, I want to mention too, is a revision of one that was done by two Preservation Machine members, Bev Schumacher and Jackie Meckhamson, presented in 2017. I took their PowerPoint and I cut about half of it off and threw some more in and changed it and rearranged everything. So, but they did a great deal of the research. And the way, so just so you know, you can kind of focus on it. I had to rearrange the things so I could keep track of where I was in town. I kept getting mixed up. So we're going to start right here in this spot, and we're going to go down Lake Avenue. We're going to look at 10th Street, then we're going to look at 11th Street, and then we're going to come back down Main to downtown, and then we'll look at some outlanding buildings, because I thought they're just so cool, we couldn't forget them. Okay. Just a little pick over there. Get that. Now, this is something Bev and Jackie found. It was a quote from a Racine newspaper saying, "One by one, the old landmarks of Racine are disappearing." When would you think that happened?
Oh, 73.
Actually, it was 1909.
Oh my goodness.
And we'll see the house that they were ripping down. It was actually an architect going to rip down his house because he wanted to build a bigger, better one. So, here we start at the Old River Lighthouse. It was at this location. It was the south side of 7th Street, about 20 feet from the street line. It was built in 1839. They had to raise it up 6 feet in 1858. Apparently they weren't seeing it well enough. And then they discontinued it in 1865. It was made completely of brick. The brick was 2 feet 8 inches thick at the bottom and 2 feet thick at the top. And it stood 40 feet tall. There was a house that went with it, and you can kind of see it in the background. I don't know how accurate this artwork is, but it said it was. It had 2 wings, one facing Chatham, now called Lake, and one just on the side. Okay. The lot on which the lighthouse stood was approximately 1 acre. In 1878, Lucius Blake and his brother-in-law, 1870, Lucius Blake and his brother-in-law, James Elliott, bought the property. Mr. Elliott got to become sole owner, and he demolished the lighthouse. He ended up using all the brick from the house and the light tower for the foundation and the walls of his house. Now it has 3 names. We call it the Elliott Deacon Wright House. That's because his daughter got married the year he died. He died in 1884. His daughter married their daughter, Jessica, was living there, and she married Mr. Wright, Clarence Wright, and they continued to live in the house. They moved out in 1931, and they moved to North Bay at the corner of Lighthouse Drive and North Vincennes. And the house stayed empty for a few years, and it was demolished in 1935. By 1958, the library was built and opened. Now, I'm going to start a story here because Mrs. Deacon, in the late 1800s, bought a pair of hollow cast iron lion statues, and she had them on display at this house for many years. In fact, they stayed there until Jessica and Clarence Wright moved to North Bay, and they took them with. A few years went by, and in 1944, they moved to 1730 Wisconsin Avenue, and the Lions went there too. Now, that's as far as we can get. We're going to go on this tour a little while, and then I'll bring them up again. But just remember, the Lions at 1730 Wisconsin, the last time we looked in. There's a plaque on the corner of 8th and Lake, site of the St. Ignatius Catholic Church, 1845 to 62. They don't say they're the first Catholic church, but the first Catholic parish. There actually was a church before this one, St. Mary's on 5th Street between College and Wisconsin. They grew so fast, they were built in 1842. They grew so fast that they built another church, and it was here. And you can see that is the parking lot of Marsh Meredith Funeral Home, and that's where it once stood. It had 2 additions added to it, and it still became so crowded, they talked about building again. And this is where the English-speaking Irish Catholics built St. Patrick's. They didn't build it like it is today, but that's where the first building was. And the German-speaking Catholics wanted their own language church too. And St. Joseph's on Erie Street and St. Mary's on 8th were built in 1852 with that demand. Now here's a fun story. The house on the right is still standing. It's one of the few still on the east side of Lake Avenue still standing. The 1838 is the house in black and white, and you can see it's got a window out. There are a number of windows broken and things like that. But Ben Hecht, the Academy Award winning writer, and a circus family lived owned both those. The Castello houses were both owned by Mrs. Castello, Frances. And she was married to a man named Dan Castello, owner of Dan Castello's Great Circus and Egyptian Caravan. There was a barn on the property, and I'm going to just jump ahead and let you see that. It's a picture of what the house looked way back, and when the barn was still there. It was an octagonal barn, and they used it to practice trapeze. They were obviously very high off the ground, but a lot of the gymnastics and things along with it, and they stored equipment in there. Francis was an equestrian. Dan was known as a vaulter, clown, and leaper, and he was the first man to take the circus across the country on the rails. That led to their split up, according to the story. He wanted her to sell that house, the one on the right, and buy another one close to the railroad tracks, so they could get the circus on the road a little easier. They quarreled. She would not do it. He left and never came back. Then she started taking in boarders to make it for an income, and many of them were circus people. So there was quite a few circus people in Racine at the time. Let's see. In 1870, Dan and Frances were 33 and 31. They had 2 children, 2 boys. By 1880, the couple had a daughter, but they had divorced. sell the 1827 house though, because she wanted to build another one larger so she could take in more boarders. She needed a higher income home. So she did keep the barn for many years after she, it was more than 20 years after she built the 838 house. It was that house, the new house, that Ben Hecht grew up in as a boy. And he tells many stories about his years in Racine in his memoir called A Child of the Century. He says that Castello Octagonal Barn is where he learned trapeze gymnastics from the landlady's son, Harry. Francis Castello died in 1920. The barn was torn down shortly after that in the early 20s. Ben Hecht by then was a celebrity journalist, short story writer, playwright, and novelist in Chicago. The destruction of the barn seemed to have pulled at his heartstrings because after that he wrote many stories and movie scripts about the circus life and the carnival people he knew in Racine. And he wrote a special article that honors Harry, the son that taught him how to build a boat, sail a boat, and how to do the trapeze in a Reader's Digest feature, The Most Unforgettable Character I Ever Met. Again, the house is still standing at 827, but in 1964, the newer house, 838, was torn down. And one last picture of that barn and what the house looked like in the early days. And now we've traveled down Lake Avenue, and we're standing at 11th, looking north. Many houses were removed from Lake Avenue, mostly by demolition, but some were moved. I think we're all familiar with the Walker houses that moved to 16th Street 20 or 30 years ago, probably 30. I didn't include them, but 7 houses that were here on this block, the 1000 block, were removed. All but one, actually, was torn down. And that one is this house. It's a brick house. It got moved to 1135 Wisconsin Avenue. So 15 houses around the East Park Square were razed. 5 were replaced with new structures. 1 was moved, and 5 remain today. I think they're counting that moved one as one of the 5, because every way I count it and go round and around that block, I don't find 5 remaining. They must be counting that. There were really only 4 that you can see around East Park. And here's a little picture of East Park. Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln used to be where the fountain used to be, right in the center. The park was set aside in 1842. It was an entire block in those days. It was meant for political gatherings, band concerts, and picnics. It was reduced by half in 1849. And a whole row of houses were on the east side there. Okay, now we're going to do a little walk up 10th Street. At 102 10th Street is Jordan Hall. That was actually Byron Blake, the Byron Blake house. Lucius Blake, that probably everybody knows about, that was his son. He built that for his son. And he was there until he died in 1903. It's also called Jordan Hall because, well, I'm jumping ahead. Let me get to that. Byron Blake was Lucius Blake's son, and Lucius was called the fanning mill king. He made so many fanning mills that he sold them throughout the country and in Europe. Now, if you don't know what a fanning mill is, it's a big thing that's got a hand crank, and you put your grain in there, and it blows out the chaff, the other junk and dirt and husk. And so you have nice, clean grain. And it was a big deal around here because Wisconsin was quite a wheat producer. Now, remembering back to our first family, it was the Elliots, and I wondered when I first researched this why Lucius Blake had anything to do with this Elliot guy. What's connected? Well, he was married to Caroline Elliot. That was her brother. The Elliots' son was named Lucius Elliot, so they got names for his uncle. And he lived in a couple of the houses that were torn down before they were empty. But this house, after Byron Blake died in 1903, Charles A. Armstrong bought it in 1920. He was a vice president of S.C. Johnson, and he was also a mayor. He served for mayor for 10 years. He's also the man that they named Armstrong Park for. Later, Horace Fenstead purchased the house and donated it to St. Luke's Hospital as a residence for male nursing students. Fenstead called it Jordan Hall in honor of his wife's father, Edward Jordan. In 1989, Preservation Racine in the Junior League had an agreement with St. Luke's Hospital trustees to try to save the building from demolition and to rehabilitate it. The house had retained a great deal of its original exterior detail. It has both Queen Anne and shingle style features. Those features include irregularity of plan, a variety of surface details, a steeply pitched roof, wide expansive porches, brackets on eaves, and curving surfaces, and the turned porch posts and spindles. Now here's a picture, not really clear, but two that are gone. There were two houses in between what we call the Christmas house and Jordan Hall. Just west of the Byron Blake house, or Jordan Hall, was the Josiah Hocking house. He was a prominent businessman and noted builder, so he probably built this house for himself in 1892. By 1930, it was a rental property. Names were changing every year in the city directory under that address. 110 10th Street was built in 1890. I don't have a lot of the first owners, but there was a significant family there. The William and Sarah Kirkby he was a prominent druggist and had a store on 6th Street. This is the house that Lucius Elliot lived in for about 10 years through the 30s. It became vacant in 1941, as did the 106 10th Street, and by 1944 they were razed. Here we have the Emily Baker, Alexander and Bertha Horlick house, which we all call the Christmas house. Robert Baker was one of the three men who were accepted into partnership with J.I. Case in 1863. He was then a quarter owner, as Case and the other three were all quarter owners. He was also a large stockholder of Manufacturers National Bank. Baker served one term as mayor. You'll find out that almost all of these guys, except the Bulls, spent at least 1 year as mayor of Racine. Some a little more, but everybody took their turn, it seemed. Actually, he then died in 1882. Mrs. Baker bought the house at 939 Main Street, which had been built in 1850. She actually put a big addition on it, a Colonial Revival addition, in 1894. Chandler, James Gilbert Chandler of Racine drew up the design for her. It was $25,000 addition, and that was really a lot of money in those days. got a right-of-way deed from the neighbors to make sure the house, the entrance, would face Park Avenue. Not Park Avenue, East Park. She wanted to be on the park. Then after all that, she died a year later. Her sons continued to live there, and they eventually sold. In 1908, Alexander and Bertha Horlick purchased the house and occupied it for 47 years. Alexander took his 4 years as mayor, right about the time they were moving into the house. They did another extensive addition in 1912. 1936, Alexander became president of Horlick Malted Milk when his father died. Again, Horace Benstead steps in. He was the head of the executive committee of Western Publishing Company. He acquired the property, renamed it for his wife, in memorial of his wife, Henrietta Benstead Hall. And that was to, he donated to St. Luke's Hospital School of Nursing to be used for to be female nursing students. The other end of the block are the boys, and this end of the block are the girls. Next is, that was a house facing the park on the lakeside. And this gentleman has quite a long resume, but I wasn't able to find him. So I'm not sure where the information that the other two people got. But he was a district attorney in Racine County. He was a state assemblyman and a circuit court judge. He served in the Civil War and eventually assumed command of the 13th Volunteer Regiment, Infantry Regiment, and was breveted a brigadier general by the end of the war. He went on to become a Wisconsin Supreme Court judge and was Chief Justice from 1892 to 1894. So his resume is good. I just couldn't find him in any city directory.
What was his name? What was his name?
It was William Lyon. Okay. Now we're going to jump over to 11th Street. This is the house on the far left is the house that they were bemoaning in the paper about landmarks disappearing. Architect A. Arthur Gilbert owned it, lived there, knocked it down, and built the house that was there in the center of the street. He wanted to build a more modern residence. The house that he knocked down was 62 years old and built by Dr. Dorchester. And many leading families of the city had lived there through the years. A. Gilbert was a Racine native who graduated from Chicago School of Architecture in 1901. He started his practice in Racine in 1903, and he joined the firm of Edmund Funston, and was there with him in 1905 to 1915, and on his own from 15 to 1922 when he died. Something that probably how he got that land was he was married to Stephen Bull's daughter, Bessie. And they had that whole corner. That was all Bull land. It was later known as E.H. Wadowitz's house. He resided there from about 1927 on, one of the founders of Western Publishing. It was raised in 1972 for the construction of East Park Tower, who incidentally, his brother, William Wadowitz, built it.
It's an ugly building.
Yeah. Now this one at 119 11th Street has been owned by three case executives: Stephen Bull, his son Frank Bull, and his son-in-law Richard T. Robinson. Now I went to the city directories to 'cause I kinda couldn't figure out how that could be. Well, I found that the Bulls did own a lot of the property on that corner where the east towers are and a little bit south, and then they were buying land on Lake. And the interesting thing is, Stephen Bull came from a family of, now I can't remember if it was 11 or 13 children. So they were farming out in Raymond, but as they had kids, you know, the farm wasn't big enough, kids came to town, and there were quite a few Bulls buying property around that area at that time. Let's see here. Stephen Bull had gone to work for his brother-in-law, J.I. Case. Case was married to Lydia Bull, and he worked for him for a long time. But in 1863, again, that is when J.I. Case accepted 3 partners, and one of them was Stephen Bull. He was quite accomplished and a good businessman. He took over the presidency when Case died. Let's see. That one also went down in 1972 for the East Park Towers. Now here's Frank Bull's house. That is facing Main. The other ones were all facing 11th Street, but this one is on 1122 Main. The drawing was created in 1887. It was raised a little earlier than the others in 1968. Now Frank Bull was Stephen Bull's son. He was born in 1857. He worked under the direct supervision of Robert H. Baker. Baker was an accountant and bookkeeper. He was a finance guy, numbers guy. When the company was incorporated, Frank Bull became the secretary and treasurer of the company, and Baker died the following year in 1882. Frank Bull became president of J.I. Case after his father retired. He's one of the few in the story that got to retire. A lot of them just died right at their desk, it seems. It was another house designed by Chandler and Park Architects of Racine. The house was later occupied by the Rowan family. Again, raised in 1968. Here's the house of the third man who became a J.I. Case company partner. That is at 1044 Main Street, and it was Messina B. Erskine, built in 1877. He was a 4-term mayor. He worked his way up in the company to company superintendent before joining the company and becoming a quarter owner. He was vice president in 1892. The mansion was considered one of the most elegant and elaborate houses ever built in Racine. It took up 1/4 block. It had 26 rooms, impressive towers, dormers, and bays, irregular roof lines, and ornamental ironwork. He lived in his house until he died in 1894. And then his daughter and her husband, Emma and Erskine Crosby, lived there for many years. It was raised in 1948 and is the site of the Evangelical United Methodist Church. And there is a remnant of the Erskine Crosby estate. There is a large black square stone right up by the sidewalk in the northeast corner of the property. And that was part of an original fence, a very elaborate stone fence that had gone around the house at one time. At 1024 Main Street was the Hart House. This is a beautiful Italianate house that was built in about 1848 for Isaac Taylor, who had gotten the plans from a house he had admired in England from a boy. He also imported all the building materials, especially the Portland cement from England. Although the house was large and very solid, the cement did not fare well in our climate, and it peeled. Mr. Taylor sold the house to George Slauson in about 1880, who sold it to Lucius Blake. I don't think Mr. Blake lived there because he quickly handed it down to his daughter, Mrs. Sands Hart. She passed it to her son, John, and it remained in the Hart family for 40 years. Again, the house's features were very thick walls, very high ceilings decorated with hand-wrought moldings of palmettes and acanthus, tall floor-to-ceiling windows, and large white marble fireplaces. Two were taken out of the house when it was going to be torn down. The Harts moved to the house at 1202 Main Street, very close, and they were installed there. Hart was a one-term mayor also. At 1002 Main Street was William Turner Lewis House. It was built in 1879, and it's just north of the Durand Mansion, or the Masonic Temple. Lewis was married to Mary B. Mitchell, daughter of Henry Mitchell of the wagon manufacturer fame. He became part of the H. Mitchell Company after working his way up. Of course, probably didn't hurt that he was married to Mary. The wagon makers sold their products throughout the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and even exported to Europe. His son, William Mitchell Lewis, and he bought the BB Wheelworks, a bicycle company, and they changed the name to Wisconsin Wheelworks, and then they manufactured bicycles, and they started making 1.5 horsepower motorcycles in 1898. And in 1902, they came out with their first motor car. They eventually changed the name to Mitchell Motor Car Company in 1904. And they merged the Mitchell Wagon Company and the Mitchell Motor Car Company and consolidated them in 1910. This house had 36 rooms and is said to be the first house in the city with running water. William T. Lewis lived in the house till he died in 1915. His wife continued on till 1931. The Masons purchased the house in 1942 for $11,150. They had nursing students in there for a little while. It seems like the nursing students got to live in a number of the finest houses in Racine as they were getting older. But it was raised in 1967 because the Masonic Temple needed more parking space. (944) Main Street, the Fred Knapp House was built in the early 1870s. It was just south of the Blake House at the corner of Main and 10th Streets. Mr. Knapp was apparently no relation to Gilbert Knapp. By 1919, it had become a boarding house. City Director's report from 1923 to 27, it was vacant and not even listed in the City Directory in 1929. But the Beth Israel Sinai Congregation had purchased the property in 1924. And I think they had kept using it as a boarding house. Maybe they even met there, I don't know. That was very unclear. But in 1943, they started a building campaign. And the new temple, they raised the building, and the new temple was built in 1951, at least according to their cornerstone. It has recently, in October of 2016, been sold to the Hope City Church, and the temple is relocated to West Racine. Now we're going to look at two survivors. The next two houses are still standing. Now, this is the Blake House, and probably everybody here knows that that's Preservation Racine's headquarters. And it also had lions. So I think I'll finish the story about the lions now. Mr. Wright went into partnership with Wishaw Construction, and they had their offices or shops on Douglas Avenue, north of Douglas in Caledonia. And the lions went up there for a while at both locations. And one night in 1974, one of the lions was stolen. And the Caledonia police found it left in a field, I don't know what field, but a Caledonia field, and it was returned to Mr. Wright. Maybe the lions had become too much trouble, but it was about at that time that they sold the lions to the Feeneys, which is why I have their house there. I think many of us know the Feeneys. So they were in the backyard for nearly 20 years, and then in the front yard starting in 1992. They were a graceful guardian of the front entrance. Now they're at Blake House. After the Feeneys passed, George Mangold, a member of Preservation Racine, bought the lions and donated them to Preservation Racine. They've been all fixed up and flowers planted around them, and they look great. And now they're our guardians. And just as a little aside, George Mangold's aunt, great aunt, Carrie, was a Lucius Blake granddaughter. So what comes around goes around. Okay. Now Lucius Blake, we've talked about him a couple of times, came to the Racine County in 1935. He farmed with his father, became a carpenter, and in 1943 he started making farm implements, especially fanning mills. The demand was so great he wound up building a factory to make them. And I kind of told you about, they were hand cranked and they blew off the chaff and the husks and the dirt from the grain. As the other farm implements began to improve, and the need for the fanning mills kind of slacked off, he got involved in diversified into many other businesses. He was also president of Racine Woolen Mills and Turner Stove Manufacturing Company and Commercial and Savings Bank. He was the director of the Chicago Rubber Clothing Company of Racine and director of Manufacturers National Bank. I guess there's no conflict of interest there when you are in charge of different banks. Now the house is a cream brick Italian villa. It's very popular style. It's an Americanized version of the Tuscan villas of Italy. The most characteristic feature is the front entrance set in the full tower with a belvedere at the top and the concave mansard roof. They have all the other Italianate features of brackets and wide eaves and tall narrow windows, arched windows, and bays. The original porch, which had been lost through the years, was reconstructed in 2016. Blake died in 1894 and continued there until 1920. His family continued there until 1926 when it was sold. It became a boarding house. In 1952, Beth Israel Sinai Congregation purchased it and converted it into 5 apartments. By 1976, the need for additional parking had led the congregation to consider demolishing it. Preservation Racine formed a consortium with the Junior League of Racine, Racine Urban Aesthetics, and Racine County Historical Society. They incorporated as the Blake House Restoration Incorporated. They had a 20-year lease. But with a lot of hard work, financial Preservation purchased the building in 2005. We'll see the Feeney's house. It's actually officially called the Walker Hagen House. Again, couple slides away. Now here is the house right next door to Lake House. On the left is what it looked like when it was built. It was built by a daughter of Case, Henrietta Case Fuller. Her husband, Percival Fuller, was a Chicago attorney. I don't know really why they had a house in Racine, since maybe he was going to try to give a law career in Racine a chance. But they built that in 1868. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm still looking at the wrong one. Yes, 1886. Again, the Chandler and Park of Racine designed the house. After 5 years, they sold it to Henrietta's brother, Jackson Case, and his wife, Henrietta Roy Case, in 1890 for $16,000. They returned, at least they relocated to Chicago. Now Jackson was the only surviving son of J.I. Case. He himself had 4 sons named Jerome I, Roy, Harry, and Percival. He was elected mayor in 1891, and he was only 25 years old. And he's been the youngest mayor Racine ever had, and he also holds the unique title of being the only father-son mayors that we've ever had. His father was mayor about 35 years earlier. Jackson was the president of J.I. Case Plow Works. He was secretary-treasurer of Racine Hotel Company. He was vice president of Dr. Shoup Family Medicine Company and the director of J.I. Case Threshing Company and Manufacturers National Bank. By the way, Case was president of, Jerome I. Case was president of the Manufacturers National Bank. Jackson was a pretty healthy person. However, his health began to fail at the turn of the century, and he died in 1903 at age 37. The house was sold in 1908 and turned into apartments in 1925, when both the interior and exterior were greatly altered. The only remaining features from the original facade are the front gables, the large round windows in the second floor, and one of the fancy brick-worked chimneys. Although this building is still standing, it is still certainly a lost architectural treasure. This insensitive modernization is not the repurposing we would hope for. Okay. At 845 Main Street was the Byron Booth Northrop House. You can see that became a parking lot too. It was raised in 1959. Byron Booth Northrop came to Racine in 1959 and established, get this, the Bank of Byron B. Booth and Company. That eventually merged with Manufacturers National Bank of Racine in 1871. Booth was married to Alice Porter, and they had 2 sons, Alan and George. They ran their uncle's furniture store that they inherited. Their uncle was William Allen Porter. In 1891, the Northrops built a house for their daughter Alice and her husband, her brand new husband, William Walker Hagen. And that's where the Feeney's house comes in again. That was the Walker Hagen house, built as a wedding present. They went through some extensive renovations in 1927, and the Wackerhagens wound up taking two of the marble fireplaces out of her parents' house and installing them in theirs. Wackerhagen died at the age of 88 in Northrop died at the age of 88, and that was 1918. And he had been a two-term mayor of Racine. The mansion around 1930 was partitioned into apartments. In the mid-50s, it became headquarters for several American Legion posts before it was razed in 1959. I include this picture because it just looks so good. It's the Henry Mitchell on the left and J.I.K.'s house on the right. And just looking at them, I can just imagine what going down the street and seeing that is like. So the Mitchell house was at 834 Main Street. Mitchell had left Scotland in 1834, lived in Chicago and Kenosha, or Southport in that day, before coming to Racine. He had been making wagons in Kenosha, but he sold that business, moved to Racine, and it began another wagon-making business. He would become the largest wagon manufacturer in the state. He took his son-in-law, William T. Lewis, into the business in 1864, and later his two sons, Henry G. and Frank L. into the business also. Henry Mitchell died in 1993. Now, the house is older than that. It was built in about 1848 by Thomas Emerson. Mitchell purchased the property from the next owner, Marshall Strong's widow, and completed an enormous addition to the house, creating elegant cream brick Italianate in 1876. In 1921, it was a boarding house, and by 1927, it was a 16-unit apartment building. There was a newspaper ad found in 1957 paper saying, "For sale, rooming house or apartment with 16 apartments, 36 rooms in all."
Wow.
By 1963, it was raised and is now the site of the Medical Arts Building. Next door at 826 Main Street was another Italianate style home, believed to have been built for the first mayor of Racine, Reuben Norton, in the 1850s. J.I.K. purchased it in 1863. I imagine he was really rolling in money, since all these other three people have bought into his company, and he did an extensive remodeling too. Case lived there until his death in 1891, and his wife in 1909. Case was a designer, inventor, and industrial genius. It said he did more than any other person to make Racine a manufacturing city. He was also the president of Manufacturers National Bank and a 3-term Racine mayor. When he died, Stephen Bull became the president of the company. His house was raised in 1928 for Elm Apartments. There was the last remnant of the Case mansion, a stone riser inscribed with the name Case that had been part of a stone fence that surrounded the yard. But I went looking for it, and I could not find it. It looks like that whole entrance has been removed and re-cemented. So everything looked like fresh cement. So that last remnant is gone. At 817 Main Street was Calvin Sinclair's house. He built this Queen Anne style in about 1878. Sinclair was married to Martha Mitchell, a daughter of Henry Mitchell, and was secretary-treasurer of the company. He died in 1901, Martha died in 1918. Then it became the home of Wisconsin State Senator Otis Wells Johnson. And going through city directories, he lived in different places all around that elite neighborhood of mansions. Every few years he changed. So I don't know if he was just renting them after they died, or if he was actually buying them. The house that was the A.A. Gilbert, the architect's house that he built, he lived there too, and then I think a couple of years he might have been in the Baker house, the Baker Horlick house. It was used also as the Oddfellows Hall. In 1972, a high school student tried to begin an alternative high school in the house, but that plan failed since it could not be brought up to code. It was impractical to try to bring it up to code. The building was raised in May of 1972 and replaced with that current convenience store building. At 723 Main Street, the Canfield Smith Constantine House was built around 1850. Canfield was a lumber dealer. One daughter, Maria, married Edward Smith. They continued on in the house after they were married. The other daughter, Catherine, married Frank Kelly. Kelly was a member of another Racine lumber family, so that had sort of united the lumber families of Racine. The homestead would remain in the family's hands until 1936. That's when Dr. and Mrs. Charles Constantine purchased the property. It had originally been a one-story house. A wing was added and a second story was added. The Constantines remodeled it further, adding an office to the residence, totaling 16 rooms. In April 1970, both the Constantines had passed away, and the building was demolished in January for the construction of a law office of their son, Charles M. Constantine, who was a partner in a law firm. There was another building apparently in between. This is almost right next to the Racine Heritage Museum, and there was a 114-year-old building that was torn down as well. That's the parking lot. So another house going down for a parking lot. Okay, now at 744 Main, this is called the William Van Pelt and Wheeler House. It was first built, the original part of the house was built in 1849. It was purchased by Margaret Van Pelt, William Van Pelt's wife. They added on and transformed a small Greek revival house into a fine Italianate with the typical bays and brackets. Pelt was a wheat dealer and a member of the Racine Common Council. Two of his children lived in the house until 1911, when one daughter who had lived there died. Her brother then sold the property in 1914 to a Dr. George and Mabel Knott. They converted it back to a single-family residence and added a doctor's office. In 1959, it became the law office of Gilbert Brock and Fred Wheeler. In 1997, the county began looking for ways to save this historical building by moving it, because they had purchased it and were planning on building a law enforcement center there. It was approved for demolition in January of 2001 because no one stepped forward to buy it and move it out of there. The house right next to it, 716 Main, was a Dr. Albert Giles house. It was a mansard roof building that was built in the 1850s, and it was used as a church for the Christian Science congregation turn of the century until it was knocked down and a Standard Oil service station was built. That was around 1920. The service station was ripped down in 1977, again, with the first part of the law enforcement building. And now we're gonna jump away from downtown, we're not gonna go far, we're just gonna go to 14th Street. Okay, and we don't have a picture of that house, but there's a big empty space. That was the John W. Bate house. His garage is still back there. But he came to Racine in 1904. He came as the vice president of Mitchell Motor Cars, and he continued in that position until 1917. And he was credited with getting Mitchell to manufacture and mass produce vehicles on an assembly line. He was considered the efficiency expert of his day. There's a sad story attached to it. Shortly after they left Chicago, their son, his son John William Bate, was involved in a murder. He was a chauffeur. He picked up his fare. He was not seen again alive. His body was found slumped over the steering wheel with 2 bullets in his head. They called it the first incident of the one-way drive. And apparently it has never been solved. So there's a lot of theories, a lot of articles have been written about that case, but never solved. And now we're looking at another parking lot. There were, the east side of the street, there were 10 family residences that were raised for St. Luke's Hospital parking lot. Although some old owners held out for a while, eventually they all went. And on the other side of the street, some of the houses were raised and some were used for hospital buildings. There was a park called the Children's Hospital at 1310, and another part was another house at 1314 was used. One of the houses was a gift from John Meacham, Dr. John G. Meacham. That was for the Children's Hospital. Okay, now we're going to jump even further away. We're going to go to 1635 12th Street. That's the Charles Herrick House. And it was Racine's own House of the Seven Gables. It was a rambling 16-room structure built in Gothic revival style in 1846 by a naval captain, Captain Thomas J. Cram. Herrick was vice president of First National Bank when he purchased the house in 1857. He also had 100 acres surrounding it. It had a solitary vantage point as being the only house on the block. It stands between Bluff and Terrace Avenues. It was constructed almost entirely of oak. They used beams and sills of 1-foot square timbers. In 1943, it was still owned by the Herrick family, and the last 5 remaining members contracted with a real estate broker who had the entire house dismantled piece by piece, and it was sold for the repair of other houses. Lumber was in very short supply due to World War II. So it wasn't raised, it was dismantled. That's kind of unique to that. And this is what sits there now. And could I pay anybody to take that down? Old A&W. That's been empty for, I think, 30 years. But my mom tells me it was a really hopping place. Yeah. Okay, now we're going to 1014 Milwaukee Avenue, now known as Dr. Martin Luther King Drive, to the M.M. Secor House. Martin M. Secor came to Caledonia from Bohemia in 1841, and he was 10 years old. In 1857, he apprenticed to a harness maker in Darien. In the fall of 1861, he started his own shop with $80 that he had saved and $100 that he had borrowed. In 1862, Secor started making trunks in his kitchen. He soon had to rent space. Within 2 years, he purchased the 3 Duranda buildings that had been railroad structures. At this time, he bought more property on Chatham Street, now Lake Avenue. And he later erected numerous manufacturing buildings for manufacturing purposes. Secor would become the oldest and last trunk manufacturer in the U.S. He was also a 2-term mayor. During his tenure as mayor, Racine saw its first street paved. He was involved in nearly every public project in the city for some 25 years. Secor was known as being kind and generous, but controversial and outspoken, which led some people to consider him to be eccentric. Maybe looking at his beautiful home would kind of reflect on that. He bought the elegant mansion in 1874. It proved too large for his family of 6, so he started taking in boarders. Looking at the 1880 census, there were the 6 Secor family members. He had 4 daughters. There were 4 servants living in the house and 18 men. They were mostly Bohemian men who worked for him. He would help them get into the United States. He'd put them to work and help them get on their feet. The estate took up the whole block. He had spacious gardens, a 5-basin fountain with goldfish, flower-lined walks, a rose conservatory, large hothouse, and fruit trees. He also loved birds and animals. His pets included 2 bears, 6 deer, a monkey, peacocks, parrots, hummingbirds, a goat, an owl, and rabbits. So maybe he wasn't a little bit. He was the only mayor who had a threat to his life made. There was a bomb planted in his driveway that was meant to go off when he came in with his carriage. However, it did not. The man who set the bomb went to see why, and it did blow. When he barely lived, he was badly injured, and one of the deer were hurt. But he was the only one. Secor died in 1911. His wife continued to live in the house till 1916, when it became vacant. In 1920 to 31, it was used as the Racine County Detention Home. The Danish Old People's Home rented it in 1932 and opened the home to residents in 1933. They purchased it in 1936. They renamed it the Danish American Home of Racine in 1970. Finally, they built a new facility at 5111 Wright Avenue in 1992. And they said they would keep the old facility going and run too, but in 1993, they announced that Homeward Bound would be buying the building. And Homeward Bound was there until 2007. But also, there was a Head Start area, so they ran a Head Start school, and there were some Racine County Services offices in the building too. But in 2012, it was demolished. And nothing's there yet, the city owns it. Last but not least, well, actually, there's one more. The Taylor home. It's 3131 Taylor Avenue. It was created, the Taylor Orphan Asylum was created in 1868 with a request to built and endowed and operated by lumberman Isaac Taylor and his wife Emily. The magnificent building was opened in July of 1872. The sprawling, gargantuan, three-story cream brick Italianate had steep gables, dormers, and a mansard roof, and with all the other typical features: bracketed eaves, a stately tall and arched windows, and stained glass windows in the chapel. The building was raised in 1972. Years later, Wendy Spencer discovered a large marble slab at the site, and that is what was used when they built the memorial Taylor and the Taylor home. They built it around with more cream city brick and used that slab of marble. Now, this is last but not least. We're going back, we're back downtown, but we're going out into the lake. And it's the Racine Reef Lighthouse, which lasted from 1906 to 1961. It's almost 2 miles out, the Racine Reef, and it had been a menace to mariners sailing between Milwaukee and Chicago for years. A buoy was placed in the reef in 1863, and in 1868, the reef was surveyed to ascertain the practicability and necessity of constructing a lighthouse. They said in that day, a season rarely passed without vessels running onto the reef. In 1901, October, the Lighthouse Board concluded that they needed a light tower, fog signal, and keeper's quarters. In 1903, Congress appropriated $75,000 for the project. The steel frame of the octagonal lighthouse had been assembled, and it had a diameter of 28.5 feet. The brickwork was used to complete the bottom 2 stories and the 4 gables on the 3rd floor. Brown brick was used in the lower level and wood brick on the top. And the lighthouse roof and upper levels were covered with copper, while the cast iron gallery and cylindrical lantern rooms were painted black. It is fitting that the Racine Reef received a castle-like structure that mirrors some of the beautiful Victorian architecture found in the city. The lighthouse actually went into service on October 6th, almost exactly 5 years from when it was decided to build it, in 1906. And it was automated in 1954. The lighthouse announced its plans to end its service, and during the summer of 1961, the picturesque lighthouse was demolished. And the only last thing I have is a list of acknowledgments, most of them from the research from